The autumn rain hammered against the cracked windows of the Chicago auction house as 23-year-old Clara Bennett stood among crates of discarded furniture and broken farm equipment. A crude sign hung around her neck reading, "Damaged Goods." ASEAs, while potential buyers examined her like livestock, their calculating eyes taking note of the fresh scars across her left cheek and the way she favored her right leg. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowded warehouse, but Clara had stopped listening hours ago. She knew what she was worth in their eyes, practically nothing, but sometimes the most broken things hold the greatest potential for beauty. And sometimes the gentlest souls come wrapped in the most intimidating packages. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gas lamps flickered in the narrow Chicago tenement as Clara Bennett carefully mended her last decent dress by their meager light. Her fingers, once soft from a life of privilege, now bore the calluses of someone who had learned to work for survival. The needle moved in practiced strokes, each stitch a small act of defiance against the circumstances that had reduced her from a respected young woman to someone society deemed unmarriageable and damaged beyond repair. Just 18 months ago, Clara had been the pride of Chicago's emerging middle class. Her father, William Bennett, owned a successful printing company that supplied newspapers and advertisements throughout the growing city. Their modest but comfortable home on the North Side had been filled with books, music, and the sound of her mother Elizabeth's gentle laughter. Clara herself had been considered quite the catch-educated, well-spoken, and possessed of a quick wit that charmed the young men who called upon her with increasing frequency. Those days felt like another lifetime now. The memory of that terrible October evening remained as vivid as if it had happened yesterday rather than over a year ago. Clara had been returning from her position at the Chicago Public Library, where she worked as an assistant librarian 3 days a week. The job wasn't necessary for their family's finances, but Clara enjoyed the intellectual stimulation and the independence it provided. She had lingered later than usual that evening, helping to catalog a new shipment of books that had arrived from New York. The streets were unusually quiet as she made her way home through the gathering dusk, her mind occupied with thoughts of the novel she had been reading, a romantic tale about a young woman finding unexpected love in frontier California. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice the 3 men following her until it was too late. They had cornered her in an alley just 2 blocks from her family's home, close enough that she could see the warm glow of their front windows in the distance. The leader, a man with scarred hands and whiskey on his breath, had grabbed her reticule first, but when he discovered it contained only a few coins and her library keys, his frustration had turned to something far more dangerous. "Pretty little thing like you should be carrying more than pocket change," he had sneered, his companions moving to block her escape routes. "Maybe you got other ways to pay for safe passage through our neighborhood." Clara had tried to run then, her heart hammering against her ribs as she desperately sought an escape route. But the alley was narrow, and the men knew the territory better than she did. When she stumbled over a loose cobblestone, they were on her in an instant. What followed was a nightmare that had changed everything about Clara's life. The men had beaten her severely, leaving her with a deep gash across her left cheek that would heal into a permanent scar, a damaged left leg that would forever leave her with a slight limp, and injuries that took months to heal properly. But the physical wounds, devastating as they were, proved to be only the beginning of her trials. The attack had been discovered by a passing police officer, who found Clara unconscious and bleeding in the alley. She had been taken to the nearest hospital, where doctors worked through the night to save her life. For days, she had hovered between consciousness and delirium, her parents maintaining a constant vigil beside her bed. When she finally woke, Clara's first concern had been for her family's reputation. In 1880's Chicago, a young woman who had been attacked in such a manner, regardless of the circumstances, was often viewed with suspicion and pity rather than sympathy. The whispered speculation about what really happened, the pointed questions about why she had been walking alone after dark, and the thinly veiled suggestions that she had somehow invited the attack had followed her family like a plague. Her father William had tried to maintain his dignity and continue his business, but the scandal had proved impossible to overcome. Customers began canceling their printing contracts, claiming they were uncomfortable doing business with a family that had been touched by such unsavory circumstances. William's attempts to defend his daughter's honor had only made matters worse, as his increasingly desperate protests were interpreted as confirmation that there was something shameful to hide. The financial decline had been swift and merciless. Within 6 months of the attack, Bennett Printing Company had lost 3/4 of its clients. William had been forced to sell their equipment to pay mounting debts, and the family had been evicted from their comfortable home. They had moved to progressively smaller and shabbier accommodations, each relocation marking another step down the social ladder. Elizabeth Bennett had struggled to cope with their changed circumstances. A gentle woman who had been raised to believe that virtue and respectability were the highest achievements a family could claim, she found herself unable to face the pitying stares and whispered gossip that followed them wherever they went. She had taken to her bed with what the doctor diplomatically called nervous exhaustion, leaving Clara to manage their increasingly desperate household while still recovering from her own injuries. The worst blow had come just 3 months ago, when William Bennett had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack while desperately trying to secure a loan to restart his business. The doctor later explained that the combination of stress, poor nutrition, and exhaustion had simply overwhelmed his system. He had died clutching a rejection letter from the last bank willing to consider his application. Elizabeth Bennett had followed her husband to the grave within a month, her fragile constitution finally succumbing to grief and despair. Clara had found herself suddenly alone in the world, with no family, no resources, and no prospects for a future that held any hope of dignity or security. The funeral expenses had consumed what little money remained from the sale of their household goods. Clara had been forced to seek employment wherever she could find it, but her visible scars and pronounced limp made employers reluctant to hire her for positions that required public interaction. The few jobs she had managed to secure, washing dishes in restaurant kitchens, cleaning offices after hours, taking in mending and laundry, barely provided enough income to pay for her tiny rented room and the most basic food. As autumn turned to winter, even those meager opportunities had become scarce. Restaurant owners complained that her appearance made customers uncomfortable. Office building supervisors worried that her limp made her too slow and unreliable for their needs. The women who had previously hired her for sewing work found excuses to take their business elsewhere. Clara had tried to maintain her dignity throughout these trials, but dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford. When her landlord had finally demanded the 3 months back rent she owed, she had been forced to face the reality that she had reached the end of her resources and options. That was when Mrs. Gertrude Hoffman had appeared in her life like a malevolent fairy godmother with an offer that seemed both salvation and damnation. Mrs. Hoffman ran what she euphemistically called an employment agency for women in difficult circumstances. In reality, she specialized in arranging domestic positions that often involved far more than housekeeping duties. But when Clara's desperate situation had come to her attention, Mrs. Hoffman had presented a different option. There are men throughout the territories, Mrs. Hoffman had explained in her precise, calculating voice, who need wives but lack the social connections to find them through conventional means. Mining camp supervisors, ranch foremen, shopkeepers in frontier towns, decent men, for the most part, but isolated by their circumstances. They're willing to pay good money for the opportunity to meet respectable women who might consider marriage. The proposal had been dressed in language that made it sound almost respectable, but Clara understood the reality. She would be sold to the highest bidder, her damaged condition reflected in whatever price she might command. The auction house that Mrs. Hoffman used specialized in difficult placements, women whose circumstances made them unsuitable for traditional matchmaking services. Your education and breeding will count for something, Mrs. Hoffman had assured her, despite your visible challenges. There are men who value intelligence and refinement in a wife. The bidding might be modest, but it will provide you with security and a chance for a new beginning. The alternative, left unspoken but clearly understood, was destitution and probable death from starvation or exposure during the approaching Chicago winter. Clara had spent 3 sleepless nights considering the proposal before finally accepting it. The decision felt like surrendering the last remnants of her former identity, but she could see no other path that offered even the possibility of survival. Now, as she sat in her tiny room putting the finishing touches on her dress, Clara tried to prepare herself mentally for what lay ahead. Tomorrow morning she would be taken to Morrison's auction house, where she would stand before a crowd of strangers and hope that someone would see enough value in her to place a bid. She had no illusions about what kind of men would attend such an auction, or what her life might become in the hands of whoever proved willing to pay for her. But she clung to the faint hope that somewhere among those buyers might be someone capable of basic kindness, someone who would treat her as a human being rather than merely property. The rain continued to fall against her window as Clara finally set aside her mending and prepared for what might be her last night of independence. Tomorrow would bring whatever fate awaited her, but tonight she allowed herself to remember the woman she had once been, educated, hopeful, and loved. She thought of her parents, gone now but once so proud of their accomplished daughter. She thought of the books she had cherished, the dreams she had harbored, the future she had imagined before that terrible night changed everything. Those memories seemed to belong to someone else now, but they remained precious to her as the only proof that her life had once held promise. As sleep finally claimed her in the pre-dawn hours, Clara whispered a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. She didn't ask for rescue or redemption. Those hopes seemed too ambitious for someone in her position. Instead, she simply asked for the strength to face whatever came next with whatever dignity she could maintain. Tomorrow, she would discover that sometimes prayers are answered in ways we never expect, and that the gentlest hearts often come wrapped in the most intimidating packages. But tonight, she was simply a young woman preparing to surrender her freedom for the chance to survive, carrying within her the fading embers of hope that refused to be completely extinguished. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning of the auction dawned gray and bitter, with November wind cutting through Chicago's streets like a blade. Clara woke before sunrise in her cramped tenement room, her body stiff from sleeping on the thin mattress that served as her only furniture. Today would determine her fate, and she felt the weight of that reality settling over her like a shroud. Mrs. Hoffman arrived promptly at 7 o'clock, her sharp features set in an expression of businesslike efficiency. She wore an expensive black coat and carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to managing human transactions. Behind her came 2 other women Clara had never seen before, both younger than herself, both bearing the same haunted expression of people who had run out of options. "Miss Bennet," Mrs. Hoffman said briskly, looking Clara up and down with a critical eye. "I trust you're prepared for today's proceedings. Remember what we discussed about presentation and demeanor. Buyers appreciate quiet dignity over dramatics." Clara nodded, having spent the past week receiving instructions on how to conduct herself during the auction. She was to stand straight despite her limp, speak only when directly questioned, and maintain an expression of calm acceptance regardless of what was said about her or what price was offered. Most importantly, she was to never let tears show, as potential buyers interpreted emotional displays as signs of instability. "These are Miss Sarah Walsh and Miss Emma Crawford," Mrs. Hoffman continued, gesturing to her companions. "They'll be participating in today's proceedings as well. I find it more efficient to handle multiple placements simultaneously." Clara studied the other women with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Sarah appeared to be in her early 20s, with auburn hair and green eyes that held a fierce intelligence despite her circumstances. Her clothing was worn but well maintained, suggesting education and refinement. Emma was perhaps 18, blonde and delicate looking, with the soft features of someone who had been sheltered from hardship until recently. Sarah lost her position as a governess, Mrs. Hoffman explained with the casual efficiency of someone discussing livestock. The family she worked for suffered financial reverses and could no longer afford her services. No references, unfortunately, due to some unpleasantness with the eldest son. Emma's situation is more straightforward: orphaned. When her parents died in a tenement fire, no family willing to take responsibility for her care. The brief summaries reduced each woman's tragedy to a few sentences, but Clara could read volumes in their expressions. Sarah's jaw was set with determination that suggested she was fighting to maintain control of her destiny. Emma's eyes held the bewildered grief of someone still trying to understand how her world had collapsed so completely. They traveled to Morrison's auction house in a hired carriage, the three women sitting in uncomfortable silence while Mrs. Hoffman reviewed her notes and made final preparations. The auction house was located in a rough section of the city near the rail yards, where the sound of train whistles and the smell of coal smoke filled the air. The building itself was a converted warehouse, its brick walls stained with soot and its windows grimy with years of accumulated dirt. Inside, the space was divided into sections for different types of merchandise. Agricultural equipment occupied one corner, household goods another, and livestock pens lined one entire wall. The human auction, Clara realized with a sick feeling, would take place on the same platform used for selling cattle and horses. Crowd of potential buyers was already gathering when they arrived. Clara had tried to prepare herself for what these men might look like, but the reality was more disturbing than her imagination had conjured. Most appeared to be exactly what she had expected: rough frontier types whose clothing and bearing marked them as men accustomed to hard physical labor and harsh living conditions. There was Jake Morrison, a cattle rancher from Montana, whose weathered face and calculating eyes suggested someone who evaluated everything in terms of practical utility. Beside him stood Seth Williams, a mine supervisor from Colorado, whose expensive boots and gold watch chain indicated significant wealth, but whose crude mannerisms revealed a lack of refinement. Thomas Clark, a merchant from a growing railroad town in Kansas, examined the women with the same attention he might give to merchandise he was considering for his store. But scattered among these expected types were men who defied easy categorization. A well-dressed gentleman with kind eyes stood near the back of the crowd, his expensive clothing and gentle bearing suggesting education and sensitivity. A tall, broad-shouldered man in simple but well-made clothing leaned against a support pillar, his massive frame somehow conveying strength rather than menace. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his beard carefully groomed, and his blue eyes held an intelligence that surprised Clara. The auction began with household goods and farm equipment, giving the women time to observe the proceedings and understand the mechanics of what would soon happen to them. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice that carried clearly across the crowded space, conducted business with practiced efficiency. Items were described, bids were called, and sales were completed with rapid-fire precision. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced as the morning progressed. 3 young ladies seeking domestic positions in frontier households. All are of good character and possess various skills useful for household management. Clara felt her stomach drop as she realized their moment had arrived. Mrs. Hoffman guided the 3 women onto the platform, positioning them in a line facing the crowd of potential buyers. The wooden boards beneath Clara's feet felt unsteady, and she had to focus on maintaining her balance while projecting the calm dignity Mrs. Hoffman had insisted upon. "First, we have Miss Sarah Walsh," the auctioneer began, consulting notes Mrs. Hoffman had provided. Age 22, experienced as a governess and tutor. Excellent references for education and refinement. Some difficulty with previous employment, but nothing reflecting on her moral character. The bidding for Sarah was brisk, with several men showing interest in her teaching abilities. Her final price of $12 seemed to satisfy Mrs. Hoffman, and Sarah was claimed by a shopkeeper from a growing town in Nebraska who needed someone to educate his children and help manage his expanding business. "Next, Miss Emma Crawford," the auctioneer continued. Age 18, gentle breeding, skilled in fine needlework and household arts, recently orphaned but of excellent moral character. Emma's youth and delicate appearance attracted considerable attention, and the bidding quickly escalated. Clara watched with a mixture of relief and concern as Emma was sold for $18 to a rancher from Wyoming, who claimed he needed a wife who could bring civilization to his remote holdings. Then, it was Clara's turn, and she felt every eye in the auction house focus on her with uncomfortable intensity. "Finally, Miss Clara Bennett," the auctioneer announced, his voice taking on a slightly apologetic tone. Age 23, well-educated and refined. Some physical challenges due to a street attack, but otherwise of good health and character. Priced to move quickly. The phrase "priced to move quickly" was Mrs. Hoffman's delicate way of acknowledging that Clara's visible scars and limp would limit her market appeal. Clara stood as straight as possible, keeping her eyes fixed on a point just above the crowd's heads to avoid making direct eye contact with potential buyers. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before the first bid was called. $2. Came a voice from the middle of the crowd. Clara couldn't see who had spoken, but the amount was so low it felt like a physical slap. $2.50, called another bidder, his tone suggesting he was bidding on damaged merchandise rather than a human being. $3, came a third voice, and Clara felt her heart sink as she realized this might be the extent of her market value. The auctioneer waited for additional bids, but the crowd seemed to have reached its limit of interest. Clara represented too much risk for too little perceived value. Her education and refinement meant nothing to men who needed wives capable of handling frontier hardships without physical limitations. Going once at $3, the auctioneer called, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet warehouse. Going twice at $3. Clara closed her eyes, trying to prepare herself for whatever fate awaited her with whoever had placed that final bid, $3. Less than the price of a decent pair of boots. The amount seemed to represent society's final judgment on her worth as a human being. "Wait," the voice came from the back of the crowd, deep and surprisingly gentle. Clara opened her eyes to see the large man she had noticed earlier stepping forward through the crowd. He was even more imposing up close, well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and powerful arms that strained the fabric of his simple cotton shirt. But his expression was kind, and his movements were careful and deliberate rather than threatening. "What's the bid?" he asked the auctioneer, his voice carrying clearly despite its quiet tone. $3, sir, going once." The big man studied Clara for a long moment, and she found herself meeting his gaze despite her earlier resolution to avoid eye contact. His blue eyes were intelligent and compassionate, holding none of the calculating assessment she had seen from other buyers. $50, he said simply. The amount was so much higher than the previous bid that it created a stir throughout the auction house. $50 represented significant money, more than many working men earned in 2 months. Several other bidders turned to stare at the man who had just dramatically escalated the proceedings. $50, the auctioneer repeated, his voice reflecting his own surprise. "Do I hear 55? But the other potential buyers seemed stunned by the sudden jump in price. $50 was far more than anyone was willing to pay for a woman they considered damaged goods. Going once at $50, the auctioneer called. Going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $50. Clara felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she realized her fate had been decided. The man who had bought her was certainly imposing, but something about his demeanor suggested kindness rather than cruelty. Still, she knew nothing about him beyond his willingness to pay far more than anyone else had considered her worth. Mrs. Hoffman completed the transaction with practiced efficiency, accepting payment and transferring Clara's few possessions to her new owner. The big man approached the platform with slow, careful steps, as if trying not to appear threatening. "Miss Bennett," he said, offering his hand to help her down from the platform. "My name is Samuel Turner. I have a wagon outside whenever you're ready." His voice was as gentle as his eyes, with an accent that suggested origins in one of the southern states. Clara accepted his assistance gratefully, noting that his hand was calloused from hard work but clean and well-maintained. "Thank you, Mr. Turner," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite her uncertainty about what lay ahead. As they walked toward the exit, Clara caught a glimpse of her reflection in one of the grimy windows. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the confident young lady who had once walked Chicago's streets without fear. But perhaps that woman had been lost forever that terrible night in the alley, and this new version of herself was about to discover what kind of life might be possible in the hands of a gentle giant who had seen something worth $50. When everyone else had seen only damaged goods, the wagon waiting outside, Morrison's auction house was unlike anything Clara had expected. Instead of the rough farm cart she had imagined, Samuel Turner had provided a well-built traveling wagon with a canvas cover to protect against weather. The seats were cushioned with thick blankets, and she could see carefully packed supplies. Secured in the back evidence of someone who planned thoroughly and cared about comfort during long journeys. Two sturdy horses stood patiently in their traces, their coats glossy with good care and their harnesses made of quality leather that had been properly maintained. Everything about the outfit suggested prosperity and attention to detail that contradicted Clara's assumptions about frontier life. "I know this must be overwhelming," Samuel said as he helped her into the wagon, his large hands gentle despite their obvious strength. "We have a long journey ahead, so please make yourself as comfortable as possible. There are extra blankets if you get cold, and food and water whenever you need them." Clara settled onto the padded seat, grateful for the consideration he was showing. After months of sleeping on a thin mattress and surviving on meager meals, even these simple comforts felt luxurious. She studied her new owner, though she forced herself to think of him as her new employer, trying to understand what kind of man had just paid $50 for someone everyone else considered worthless. Samuel Turner was indeed an imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His dark brown hair was neatly trimmed and his beard carefully groomed, suggesting attention to personal appearance despite his obvious connection to physical labor. His clothes were simple but well-made sturdy wool trousers, a cotton shirt that stretched across his powerful chest, and leather boots that showed wear but also proper care. But it was his eyes that challenged all of Clara's preconceptions about what kind of man would attend such an auction. They were a warm blue, intelligent and kind, holding none of the calculating hardness she had seen in other bidders. When he looked at her, she saw concern and gentleness rather than ownership or dominance. "May I ask where we're traveling?" Clara ventured as Samuel took his place beside her and gathered the reins. "Nebraska," he replied, his deep voice carrying a slight accent that suggested origins in Virginia or one of the Carolinas. "I have a ranch about 3 days' ride from Omaha. Good land, plenty of water, and far enough from town to offer privacy, but close enough to civilization when it's needed." As they pulled away from the auction house and began navigating Chicago's busy streets, Clara found herself studying the city that had been her home for the past 3 years. The buildings and neighborhoods that had once represented security and belonging now felt like part of a life that belonged to someone else. She was leaving behind everything familiar, traveling into unknown territory with a stranger who owned her services for reasons she didn't yet understand. "Mr. Turner," she said carefully, "I feel I should be honest about my limitations. The auction papers were accurate about my injuries. I walk with a limp, and my left side isn't as strong as it once was. If you're expecting someone capable of heavy physical labor, you may be disappointed with your purchase." Samuel glanced at her with surprise, as if the thought hadn't occurred to him. "Miss Bennett, I didn't buy your services because I needed a field hand. I have plenty of capable men working for me who can handle the physical demands of ranch work." "Then, why?" Clara asked, genuinely puzzled. $50 is a considerable sum. There were younger, prettier women available who could offer you more than I can." Samuel was quiet for several minutes as he guided the wagon through the crowded streets, seemingly considering how to answer her question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a thoughtful quality that suggested he was sharing something personal. 5 years ago, my sister Margaret was traveling alone when her stagecoach was attacked by bandits," he said slowly. "She was injured in the attack, not physically, but in ways that society considers compromising to a woman's reputation. When she finally made it to a town, no one would help her. She was treated like damaged goods, whispered about, shunned by people who should have shown Christian charity." Clara felt her heart clench with recognition and sympathy. "Margaret never recovered from the shame of it," Samuel continued, his knuckles white where he gripped the reins. "She died 2 years later, and I've always believed it was because she lost hope that anyone would ever see her as worthy of respect and kindness again." The revelation cast Samuel's actions in an entirely different light. He hadn't bought Clara because he needed a servant or even a wife. He had bought her because he understood what it meant to be discarded by society and wanted to offer someone else the chance his sister had never received. "I'm sorry for your loss," Clara said softly, "and I'm grateful for your kindness, though I'm not sure I deserve it." "Everyone deserves basic human dignity," Samuel replied firmly. "What happened to you wasn't your fault, and it doesn't define your worth as a person. I hope that during our journey and in your time at the ranch, you'll come to believe that again." They traveled west out of Chicago as the day progressed, the urban landscape gradually giving way to farmland and open prairie. The autumn countryside was beautiful in its starkness, with golden fields stretching to distant horizons and groves of trees, showing their final burst of color before winter claimed them. Clara found herself relaxing as they put miles between themselves and the city. The steady rhythm of the horses' hooves and the gentle swaying of the wagon created a peaceful atmosphere that allowed her to truly rest for the first time in months. Samuel proved to be a considerate traveling companion, stopping regularly to rest the horses and asking if she needed anything without being intrusive about it. "Tell me about your ranch," Clara said during one of their rest stops, genuinely curious about her destination. Samuel's face lit up with obvious pride and enthusiasm. "It's beautiful country," he said, leaning against the wagon wheel as the horses grazed nearby. "Rolling hills with good grass for cattle, a clear stream that runs year-round, and enough timber to provide everything we need for building and fuel. I've been there 3 years now, building it up from nothing. You said you have men working for you. How large an operation is it?" "About 50 head of cattle currently, with plans to expand as the markets grow. 6 full-time hands who live in the bunkhouse, plus seasonal workers during roundup and branding. We're not the biggest ranch in the territory, but we're profitable and growing steadily." Clara could hear the satisfaction in his voice as he described his achievements. This was clearly a man who took pride in honest work and building something lasting. It made his presence at the auction even more puzzling. "If you don't mind my asking," she said carefully, "why didn't you find a wife through more conventional means?" A successful rancher should have no trouble attracting respectable women through normal social channels. Samuel's expression grew somber. "I tried that approach when I first arrived in Nebraska. Attended church socials, community gatherings. Even traveled to Omaha several times to meet eligible ladies. But I discovered that my size makes many women uncomfortable. They see me as intimidating rather than protective, threatening rather than gentle." Clara studied his massive frame and could understand how his physical presence might overwhelm someone meeting him for the first time. But she had already observed his careful movements, his gentle voice, and his obvious efforts to avoid appearing threatening. "Their loss," she said impulsively, then felt her cheeks redden at her boldness. Samuel looked at her with surprise and what might have been gratitude. "Thank you for saying that. I hope you'll continue to feel that way as you get to know me better." They camped that first night beside a stream, Samuel setting up a comfortable arrangement with the wagon, providing windbreak and blankets, creating a warm sleeping area. He prepared a simple but satisfying meal over the campfire, demonstrating cooking skills that suggested considerable experience living outdoors. "I'll sleep under the wagon," he said as they finished eating. "You'll have privacy and warmth inside. Don't hesitate to wake me if you need anything during the night." His consideration for her comfort and modesty impressed Clara. This was clearly a man who understood how to treat a lady with respect, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. As she settled into the warm nest of blankets inside the wagon, Clara reflected on how dramatically her circumstances had changed in just one day. This morning she had been a desperate woman, facing an uncertain fate. Tonight she was traveling west with a gentle giant who seemed determined to treat her with kindness and dignity. The second day of travel brought them deeper into farm country, where they passed homesteads and small communities that represented the expanding frontier. Samuel proved to be an engaging conversationalist, sharing stories about the people and places they encountered while asking thoughtful questions about Clara's background and interests. She found herself talking more freely than she had in months, discussing books she had loved, her work at the library, even her dreams of someday writing stories of her own. Samuel listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions that showed he was truly paying attention to what she said. "You should continue writing," he said when she mentioned her abandoned literary aspirations. "The ranch has a good library, and there's plenty of quiet time during winter months for creative pursuits." The casual assumption that she would have time and opportunity for such luxuries touched Clara deeply. For so long, survival had consumed all her energy and attention. The idea that she might once again have leisure for intellectual pursuits seemed almost too wonderful to believe. Their second night was spent at a wayside inn, where Samuel rented separate rooms and treated Clara with the courtesy due a traveling companion rather than purchased property. The innkeeper's wife, noting Clara's obvious refinement despite her simple clothes, engaged her in pleasant conversation about books and current events that made her feel human and valued. By the third day, Clara realized that her initial fear and uncertainty were being replaced by something she hadn't dared hope for: genuine optimism about her future. Samuel had proven himself to be everything he appeared: kind, intelligent, protective without being controlling, and determined to treat her with respect regardless of their unusual circumstances. As they crossed into Nebraska territory and the landscape opened into the vast expanses of prairie that would be her new home, Clara felt something awakening inside her that had been dormant since that terrible night in Chicago. Hope. For the first time in over a year, she could envision a future that held possibility rather than mere survival. The gentle giant beside her had paid $50 not for a servant or even a wife, but for the opportunity to restore someone's faith in human kindness. As Clara watched the endless grasslands stretch toward distant horizons, She began to believe that perhaps she was worth far more than $3 after all. The Turner Ranch appeared on the horizon, like something from Clara's abandoned dreams of frontier life. Rolling green hills stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with grazing cattle and crossed by a crystalline stream that caught the afternoon sunlight like liquid silver. The main house sat on a gentle rise, its whitewashed logs and wide front porch creating an image of prosperity and permanence that took Clara's breath away. "Welcome home," Samuel said simply as they crested the final hill, and Clara felt something stir in her chest at his choice of words. Home, it had been so long since she'd had a place that deserved that name. As their wagon approached the main compound, Clara could see the evidence of Samuel's 3 years of hard work. The ranch buildings were well constructed and thoughtfully arranged, a large barn with fresh red paint, a bunkhouse for the hired hands, several storage buildings, and corrals that spoke of a man who understood both cattle and construction. Everything was clean, organized, and built to last. The ranch hands emerged from various buildings to greet their returning boss, and Clara studied them with curiosity. These were clearly hard-working men, their clothing practical and worn from honest labor, but she was struck by their respectful demeanor toward Samuel. There was no servile fear in their greetings, but rather the easy camaraderie of men who respected their employer and knew they were fairly treated. "Boys, I'd like you to meet Miss Clara Bennett," Samuel announced as he helped her down from the wagon. "She'll be managing the household and helping with the business correspondence. I expect you to treat her with the respect due a lady." The foreman, a weathered man in his 50s named Jack Morrison, stepped forward and touched his hat brim politely. "Welcome to the Turner Ranch, Miss Bennett. We're pleased to have a lady's touch around here." The boss has been trying to manage the house himself, and while he's good at many things, domestic arrangements ain't among them. The other hands chuckled good-naturedly at this gentle ribbing of their employer, and Clara felt some of her nervousness ease. These men seemed decent and respectful, not the rough frontier type she had feared encountering. Samuel led her toward the main house, carrying her small bag with the same careful gentleness he had shown throughout their journey. "I should warn you," he said as they climbed the front steps, "the house is functional but lacks feminine touches. I built it with durability in mind rather than beauty." The interior proved him wrong on the beauty count, though Clara could see what he meant about feminine touches. The main room was spacious and well lit, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows, positioned to take advantage of the prairie views. The furniture was clearly handmade, but showed fine craftsmanship, heavy oak pieces built to last generations. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with an impressive collection that immediately caught Clara's attention. "You have excellent taste in literature," she observed, scanning titles that ranged from classical poetry to modern novels, scientific treatises to philosophical works. "This collection rivals what I saw in Chicago's best homes." Samuel looked pleased by her assessment. "Books were one of the first things I invested in when I started turning a profit. A man can feed his body with good food, but his mind needs nourishment too." The kitchen was large and well equipped, with a modern cast-iron stove and an abundance of storage space. Clara could see evidence of Samuel's bachelor cooking practical, but uninspired meals prepared with little attention to presentation or variety. The dining room featured a sturdy table that could seat 8, clearly built with entertaining in mind, even though Samuel had mentioned he rarely had visitors. "Your quarters are upstairs," Samuel said, leading her to a staircase built with the same solid craftsmanship as everything else in the house. "I hope you'll find them comfortable." The room he showed her exceeded every expectation Clara had dared form. It was large and bright, with 2 windows offering spectacular views of the rolling ranch land. A comfortable bed dominated one corner, made up with clean linens and a beautiful quilt that showed feminine handiwork. A writing desk sat positioned to catch the morning light, and a wardrobe stood ready to hold more clothing than Clara currently possessed. "This is beautiful," Clara said softly, running her hand over the smooth surface of the writing desk. "Did you make all of this?" "The furniture, yes. The quilt was made by Mrs. Henderson, the pastor's wife in town. She insisted the house needed at least one thing made by a woman's hands." Samuel's cheeks reddened slightly. "I may have mentioned to a few people that I was hoping to find a wife eventually." The admission was endearing in its awkwardness, and Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. This gentle giant had been planning for a woman's presence in his home long before he attended the auction that changed her life. "Your room is at the other end of the hall," Samuel continued, his voice carefully neutral. "You'll have complete privacy, and I want you to know that you're perfectly safe here. Whatever arrangement we eventually work out between us, it will be based on mutual respect and your willingness to be here." The careful way he spoke told Clara that he was addressing questions she hadn't known how to ask. Her legal status might be unclear. She had been purchased at auction, after all, but Samuel was making it clear that he had no intention of forcing unwanted attentions on her. That evening, Clara prepared her first meal in the ranch kitchen, determined to prove her worth despite her physical limitations. She found the pantry well stocked with quality ingredients and set about creating a dinner that would showcase skills developed during better times in her family's home. The result was a roast chicken with herb stuffing, fresh biscuits, green beans with bacon, and an apple pie made from fruit preserved in the root cellar. When Samuel and the ranch hands gathered around the dining table, their expressions of amazement and appreciation made all her effort worthwhile. "Miss Clara," said Tom Bradley, one of the younger hands, "this is the finest meal I've had since my mother's cooking back in Missouri. If the boss doesn't marry you, I might have to propose myself." The good-natured laughter that greeted this comment helped Clara feel accepted as part of the ranch community. Samuel's eyes met hers across the table, and she saw approval and gratitude in his expression. Over the following days, Clara threw herself into organizing the household with an energy she hadn't felt in months. The domestic challenges were significant: cooking for 8 men, maintaining a large house, managing supplies and correspondence, but they engaged skills she had thought lost forever and gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life. Samuel proved to be an ideal employer, giving her complete authority over household matters while remaining available for consultation when needed. He treated her suggestions about menu planning and supply ordering with the same respect he would show a business partner, and her efforts to organize his correspondence and financial records earned his obvious appreciation. "You've transformed this place," he told her after a week, looking around the kitchen where she had created systems for everything from meal planning to inventory management. "It's starting to feel like a real home instead of just a place where I sleep between work days." But it was the evenings that Clara treasured most. After the dinner dishes were cleared and the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse, she and Samuel would sit in the main room, reading by lamplight or discussing the day's events. These conversations revealed depths to Samuel's character that impressed her more each day. He was widely read and genuinely interested in her opinions on everything from literature to politics. His questions about her writing encouraged her to share stories she had been crafting in her mind, and his enthusiasm for her creative efforts gave her confidence to begin putting words on paper again. "You have a gift for character development," he said after reading one of her short stories. "The people you create feel real, like I might meet them in town tomorrow." The praise meant more to Clara than any compliment she had ever received. For the first time since her attack, someone was seeing and valuing her intellectual capabilities rather than focusing on her physical limitations. Samuel's own character revealed itself in countless small ways. She observed his fairness with the ranch hands, his kindness to animals, his careful stewardship of the land. When a neighboring family faced hardship due to illness, he quietly provided assistance without seeking recognition. When one of his horses injured a leg, He personally nursed the animal back to health with patience and skill. Most importantly, she noticed how he treated her not as purchased property or even as a grateful dependent, but as an equal deserving of respect and consideration. He asked her opinion on ranch matters, included her in discussions about future plans, and never made her feel like her presence was merely tolerated. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, Clara woke to find the first snow of winter dusting the prairie in pristine white. The sight filled her with contentment rather than the anxiety that approaching winter had once brought. She had warm shelter, meaningful work, and the companionship of a man whose character grew more admirable with each passing day. As she prepared breakfast in the well-stocked kitchen, Clara reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. 2 months ago, she had been a desperate woman facing destitution and despair. Now she was managing a prosperous household, using skills she had thought worthless, and discovering capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. More significantly, she was beginning to understand why Samuel Turner had paid $50 for someone the rest of the world valued at $3. He hadn't bought a servant or even a potential wife. He had invested in a fellow human being's potential for happiness and worth, offering her the chance to rebuild a life of dignity and purpose. When Samuel entered the kitchen for his morning coffee, Clara made a decision that had been growing in her heart for days. "Samuel," she said, using his first name for the first time since arriving at the ranch, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. You've given me more than shelter and work. You've given me back my self-respect." Samuel's face lit up with a smile that transformed his intimidating features into something gentle and warm. "Clara, you've given me something I didn't even know I was missing. This house was just a building before you arrived. Now it's a home." As snow continued to fall outside the kitchen windows, Clara felt the last vestiges of her old fears melting away. The gentle giant who had seen her true worth was helping her discover that she was capable of far more than either of them had imagined. The blizzard struck without warning on a gray December morning, transforming the Nebraska prairie into a howling wilderness of snow and ice. Clara woke to the sound of wind rattling the house's sturdy windows and the strange, muffled silence that comes when snow begins to pile deep against walls and doors. From her bedroom window, she could see nothing but swirling white. The barn, visible just 50 yards away on a clear day, had disappeared entirely into the storm. This was her first taste of a true prairie winter, and the raw power of it both thrilled and terrified her. Samuel was already in the kitchen when she came downstairs, his face etched with concern as he studied the storm through the frost-covered windows. "Bad one," he said simply. "Could last 3 days, maybe more. The hands are already snowed in at the bunkhouse, and will likely lose communication with town until it passes." The isolation that had once seemed peaceful suddenly felt precarious. Clara understood now why Samuel had spent so much effort stockpiling supplies and ensuring every building was winterized. Out here, with the nearest neighbors miles away, and the nearest town a full day's travel in good weather, self-sufficiency wasn't just practical, it was survival. "What do we need to do?" Clara asked, already moving toward the stove to begin breakfast. The question came naturally now, this assumption that they would face challenges together. "Keep the fires going, check on the livestock every few hours, and make sure the paths to essential buildings stay clear," Samuel replied. "The real danger isn't the cold itself. This house is built to handle Nebraska winters. It's isolation. If someone gets hurt or we run into serious problems, there's no help coming until the storm passes." They spent the morning establishing routines for managing the crisis. Samuel made regular trips to the barn to check on the horses and milk cow, each journey requiring him to rope himself to the house to avoid getting lost in the whiteout conditions. Clara organized the kitchen and main room for extended indoor living, preparing meals that could stretch their preserved foods and planning activities to combat the cabin fever that could drive people to dangerous decisions during prolonged isolation. By afternoon, the storm had intensified beyond anything either of them had experienced. The wind screamed around the house with such force that the solid log walls actually swayed slightly, and snow began finding its way through gaps in the window frames, despite Samuel's careful winterizing efforts. "I need to check the horses again," Samuel announced as the light began to fade. "They'll need extra feed to maintain body heat in this cold, and I want to make sure the barn roof is holding." Clara watched him bundle into his heaviest coat and wrap rope around his waist, tying the other end to the kitchen door frame. The sight of this powerful man taking such precautions drove home the real danger they faced. Men had died in storms like this, lost between their house and barn, frozen just yards from safety. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Clara found herself watching the clock with growing anxiety, calculating how long it should take Samuel to complete his tasks. When 45 minutes had elapsed with no sign of his return, she began to worry seriously. An hour after Samuel's departure, Clara made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. She wrapped herself in her warmest clothing, tied a second rope to the doorframe, and followed Samuel's path into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water instantly. The wind was so strong she could barely maintain her footing, and the driving snow made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Only the rope guide kept her oriented as she fought her way toward the barn. She found Samuel collapsed in the barn doorway, conscious but unable to stand. A section of the roof had partially given way under the weight of snow, and a falling beam had struck his left leg. He had managed to repair the worst of the damage and secure the animals, but the injury had left him unable to make the return journey. "Clara, what are you doing here?" he gasped when he saw her struggling through the door. "You should have stayed in the house. If something happened to both of us... Nothing's going to happen to either of us," Clara replied with a determination that surprised them both. Despite her limp and the challenges of moving through deep snow, adrenaline and purpose gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. "Can you put weight on that leg at all?" Samuel attempted to stand and immediately went pale with pain. "Something's broken," he admitted. "I can't make it back to the house on my own." Clara studied their situation with the same analytical mind she had once applied to library cataloging. The barn was warm and stocked with feed, but it lacked the medical supplies and comfort Samuel would need for proper recovery. The house was only 50 yards away, but it might as well have been 50 miles in these conditions for a man who couldn't walk. "We're going to take this in stages," she decided. "First, I'll get you more comfortable here and assess the injury properly. Then we'll figure out how to get you back to the house." Working by lamplight, Clara helped Samuel move to a pile of hay bales where she could examine his leg. Her hands, steady despite the cold and stress, found the break just below his knee, a clean fracture that would heal well if properly set, but was currently causing significant pain and making walking impossible. "I need to splint this before we attempt to move you," she said, drawing on half-remembered knowledge from her father's medical books. "And we'll need something to help you travel through the snow." The solution came to her as she studied the barn's equipment. One of the horse sleds used for moving feed could be modified to transport Samuel. It would be difficult for her to pull, especially with her own physical limitations, but it was their best option. Clara spent the next 2 hours creating a makeshift transport system. She lined the sled with blankets, fashioned a splint for Samuel's leg using barn wood and leather straps, and rigged additional ropes to give her better control while pulling the improvised stretcher. "This is madness," Samuel protested as she helped him onto the sled. "You can't possibly pull me through this storm. Your leg, your strength, it's too much risk." "I've been underestimated before," Clara replied, adjusting the ropes around her shoulders. "Sometimes that works in my favor." The journey back to the house tested every bit of determination Clara possessed. The sled was heavy, the snow was deep, and the wind fought her every step. Her injured leg screamed with pain as she struggled to maintain footing on the slippery ground, and several times she nearly lost the rope that was their lifeline to safety. She had discovered something about herself during those months of surviving in Chicago, something that the comfortable life of her youth had never revealed. She was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. When survival demanded it, she could push past pain, past fear, past the limitations that society had tried to impose on her. 20 agonizing minutes later, they reached the house. Clara managed to get Samuel inside and onto the sofa near the fireplace before her own strength finally gave out. She collapsed into a chair, breathing heavily and shaking from exhaustion and cold. "You saved my life," Samuel said simply as Clara worked to get him comfortable and warm. "If you hadn't come looking for me, I would have frozen in that barn." "You saved mine first," Clara replied, building up the fire and preparing hot coffee. "In Chicago, at the auction house, and every day since. This just makes us even." Over the following 3 days, as the storm raged outside and Samuel's leg began to heal, their relationship transformed in ways neither had anticipated. Clara took complete charge of Samuel's care, demonstrating competence and authority that belied her supposed status as damaged goods. She managed his pain, changed his bandages, and organized the household to function smoothly despite his incapacity. More significantly, the enforced intimacy of their situation, Clara helping Samuel with tasks he couldn't manage alone. The two of them confined together in the main room, where he could stay warm, broke down the careful formality they had maintained since her arrival. "I need to tell you something," Samuel said on the storm's second day as Clara helped him shift position on the sofa. "What I said about buying you to help someone the way I couldn't help Margaret, that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." Clara paused in adjusting his pillows, sensing that something important was coming. "The moment I saw you on that auction platform," Samuel continued, his voice quiet but intense, "I knew you were someone special. Not because of your education or refinement, though those matter. It was something in your eyes, your bearing. You were facing the worst moment of your life with dignity and courage. I wanted to know the woman who could stand that straight when everything was falling apart around her." The admission sent warmth flooding through Clara's chest. "So you paid $50 for curiosity?" "I paid $50 because I recognized someone worth far more than that, and I hoped she might someday recognize the same thing in me." Honesty in his voice, the vulnerability of his confession, stirred something in Clara that had been dormant since her attack. For the first time in over a year, she felt not just gratitude or friendship, but the beginning of something deeper. "Samuel," she said softly, taking his hand in both of hers, "I recognized your worth the moment you stepped forward at that auction. Any woman who can't see past your size to the gentleness underneath doesn't deserve you." When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, revealing a world transformed by snow and ice, Clara and Samuel had crossed an invisible threshold in their relationship. They were no longer employer and employee, or even just friends. They had become partners in the truest sense, bound by mutual respect, shared trials, and the growing recognition that they were stronger together than either could be alone. As Samuel's leg healed over the following weeks and normal ranch routines resumed, their relationship continued to deepen. The crisis had revealed capabilities in both of them that they hadn't known existed, and it had proven that their partnership could weather any challenge. Spring still seemed impossibly distant, but Clara no longer feared the isolation or the hardships that Nebraska winters could bring. She had discovered that she was far more resilient than anyone had ever believed, and she had found a man who valued that strength as much as he cherished her gentleness. The woman who had been sold as damaged goods for $3 had proven herself worth infinitely more. And the gentle giant who had seen her true value was beginning to understand that he had received far more than he had paid for. Spring arrived in Nebraska with explosive beauty, transforming the snow-covered prairie into an ocean of wildflowers and fresh green grass. Clara stood on the front porch of the ranch house, watching Samuel work with a young colt in the training corral. His leg had healed completely from the winter break, but she noticed he still favored it slightly when he thought no one was watching. The past 4 months had brought changes to both of them that went far deeper than the season's transformation. The winter crisis had stripped away pretense and revealed the true strength of their partnership. Now, with Samuel's recovery complete and spring work demanding attention, they had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Clara had taken on expanded responsibilities that utilized every aspect of her education and capabilities. Beyond managing the household, she now handled all ranch correspondence, maintained financial records, and even assisted with strategic planning for herd expansion. Samuel sought her input on major decisions, treating her insights with the respect due a full business partner. More significantly, the careful formality that had characterized their early relationship had evolved into easy intimacy. They worked together seamlessly, anticipated each other's needs, and shared conversations that ranged from practical ranch matters to philosophical discussions that lasted long into the evening. "Clara," Samuel called from the corral, his voice carrying joy that made her heart flutter. "Come see how Thunder's responding to the new training method you suggested." She walked carefully down the porch steps, her limp barely noticeable now that she had learned to compensate for it naturally. The young stallion Samuel was working with had been considered untrainable by his previous owner, but Clara's suggestion to use patience and consistency rather than force was proving remarkably effective. "He's beautiful," Clara said, watching the coal-black horse respond to Samuel's gentle commands with eager cooperation. "Look how he watches your face for cues. He wants to please you, just like his trainer learned to watch a certain lady's face for approval." Samuel replied with a warm smile that sent heat rushing to Clara's cheeks. Their growing romantic attachment had remained unspoken but increasingly obvious. Samuel's touches lingered when he helped her with heavy tasks. Clara found herself inventing reasons to brush against him while they worked in the kitchen. Their conversations carried undertones of affection that neither had quite found courage to address directly. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their peaceful morning, and Clara shaded her eyes to see 3 riders cresting the hill that led to their valley. Visitors were rare at the Turner Ranch, and something about these particular riders made Samuel's expression grow wary. As they drew closer, Clara could see that the lead rider was a woman, dressed in expensive traveling clothes that seemed impractical for Nebraska terrain. Behind her rode 2 men whose bearing suggested they were more than simple escorts. Everything about the group spoke of Eastern wealth and authority. "Samuel Turner," the woman called as they reached the yard. Her voice carried an imperious tone that immediately set Clara's nerves on edge. "I am Mrs. Victoria Blackwood from Boston. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Samuel stepped protectively closer to Clara, his body language shifting into alertness that bordered on hostility. "I'm not aware of possessing anything of yours, Mrs. Blackwood. Perhaps you could explain your business here." Mrs. Blackwood dismounted with practiced grace, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the ranch buildings and eventually fixing on Clara with undisguised calculation. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of refined features that spoke of generations of breeding and privilege. "My business concerns Miss Clara Bennett," Mrs. Blackwood announced, producing a leather portfolio from her saddlebag. "I represent certain interests in Chicago who have questions about the circumstances surrounding her acquisition." Clara felt ice form in her stomach as she realized the implications. Somehow, her past had followed her to this remote ranch, where she had finally found peace and purpose. "What kind of interests?" Samuel demanded, moving to stand slightly in front of Clara in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Legal interests," Mrs. Blackwood replied smoothly. "It seems there were irregularities in the auction where Miss Bennet was sold. Questions have been raised about whether she was legally free to enter into such an arrangement." The woman's companions dismounted and positioned themselves strategically, their hands resting casually near weapons that suggested they were prepared for trouble. Clara recognized the type from her Chicago days, men who used intimidation and force when legal maneuvering proved insufficient. "I'm perfectly free," Clara said, finding her voice despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "I entered into my arrangement with Mr. Turner voluntarily to settle legitimate debts." Mrs. Blackwood's smile was coldly predatory. But that's where the situation becomes complicated, my dear. You see, there are those who claim your father's debts were fraudulent, designed to force you into circumstances that no respectable woman should endure." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Clara understood immediately what was happening. Someone had discovered that Samuel Turner possessed a valuable ranch and a woman of refinement, and they intended to exploit both for their own benefit. "Who exactly are you representing?" Samuel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Concerned citizens who believe Miss Bennet was the victim of a criminal conspiracy," Mrs. Blackwood replied. "They've empowered me to investigate her situation, and if necessary, arrange for her return to proper society in Chicago." Clara felt panic rising in her throat. The life she had built here, the partnership she had formed with Samuel, the love that was growing between them, all of it could be destroyed by legal machinations she didn't understand and couldn't fight. "I don't want to return to Chicago," Clara said firmly. "I'm happy here. I have meaningful work and people who value me." "My dear child," Mrs. Blackwood said with false sympathy, "you can't possibly understand the full implications of your situation. You've been isolated here, dependent on a man who purchased you like livestock. Surely you must see that such an arrangement is degrading to any woman of proper breeding." The condescension in her tone sparked anger in Clara that burned away her fear. "Mr. Turner has treated me with more respect and kindness than I ever received from proper society. He values my intelligence, my capabilities, and my character. That's something your concerned citizens never bothered to do." Mrs. Blackwood's expression hardened at Clara's defiance. "Nevertheless, certain legal obligations must be addressed. I have documents here that require your immediate attention." She opened her portfolio and withdrew official-looking papers that she thrust toward Clara. "A court in Chicago has issued a writ of habeas corpus, demanding your return to Illinois to testify about the circumstances of your sale. You're legally required to comply." Samuel took the documents and studied them with growing anger. "These papers are from a county court with no jurisdiction in Nebraska territory. They have no legal force here." "Perhaps not," Mrs. Blackwood agreed. "But they do raise questions about Mr. Turner's legal right to retain Miss Bennet's services. Questions that could result in very serious criminal charges if not properly addressed." The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Clara realized they were facing a sophisticated form of extortion designed to destroy the life she and Samuel had built together. "What do you really want?" Clara asked bluntly. "Because this isn't about my legal status or my welfare." Mrs. Blackwood's mask of concern slipped slightly, revealing calculating avarice underneath. "Miss Bennet has inherited certain properties in Chicago from relatives she was unaware of. Properties that require her immediate attention and proper legal representation." The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. Clara had no relatives in Chicago, no hidden inheritance waiting to be claimed. This was purely a scheme to separate her from Samuel and exploit whatever assets they thought she could access. "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said with finality. "I have no inheritance in Chicago, no relatives to claim me, and no desire to leave the life I've chosen here." Mrs. Blackwood's expression turned ugly. "I'm afraid the choice isn't yours to make, my dear. The law requires your compliance, and these gentlemen are prepared to ensure you fulfill your legal obligations." Her companions stepped forward menacingly, their intentions clear. They were prepared to take Clara by force if necessary, using fraudulent legal documents to justify kidnapping. Samuel moved with startling speed for such a large man, positioning himself between the hired thugs and Clara while simultaneously reaching for the rifle that hung over the ranch house door. "You're on my property making threats against a woman under my protection," he said in a voice that carried deadly promise. "I suggest you reconsider your approach." The standoff might have escalated into violence, but the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of reinforcements. Jack Morrison and 3 other ranch hands appeared from the direction of the spring pasture, drawn by the commotion and clearly prepared to support their employer. Mrs. Blackwood assessed the changed situation quickly, her predatory instincts warning her that the odds had shifted decisively against her. "This matter isn't finished," she announced, signaling her companions to remount. "Miss Bennett's legal obligations remain unchanged, and there are authorities who will ensure they're fulfilled." As the unwelcome visitors departed, Clara felt her legs give way beneath her. Samuel caught her before she could fall, his strong arms providing the security she desperately needed. "They'll be back," she whispered against his chest. "With more men, better legal documents, whatever it takes to separate us." "Let them come," Samuel replied grimly. "This is Nebraska territory, not Chicago. Out here, a man protects what's his. And you're mine in every way that matters." The possessive declaration sent warmth through Clara, despite her fear. But she understood that Mrs. Blackwood's visit was only the beginning of a larger threat. Someone had discovered their happiness and prosperity, and they were determined to destroy both for their own profit. As evening fell and the ranch hands maintained extra watches, Clara and Samuel began planning their response to what was clearly going to be an extended battle. The peaceful life they had built together was under attack, but they would face this challenge as they had faced the winter crisis together, with determination and with absolute faith in each other's strength. The woman who had been sold as damaged goods was about to discover just how fiercely a gentle giant would fight to protect the treasure he had found. The morning after Mrs. Blackwood's threatening visit, Samuel rode out before dawn to the neighboring Hendricks Ranch, leaving Clara under the watchful protection of Jack Morrison and 2 armed ranch hands. She had protested being treated like an invalid, but Samuel's jaw had been set with determination that brooked no argument. "I'm not leaving you undefended while that woman and her hired guns are in the area," he had said firmly. "Jack's a good shot, and Tom and Billy know how to handle trouble. You'll be safe until I return." Clara spent the anxious morning organizing Samuel's business papers and correspondence, her mind working through the legal implications of Mrs. Blackwood's claims. Her father's work at the Chicago law firm had given her enough knowledge to recognize that the documents presented were likely fraudulent, but she also understood that fraud could be difficult to prove, especially when facing opponents with unlimited resources. It was nearly noon when Samuel returned, accompanied by 3 riders who immediately eased Clara's fears. Pastor Daniel Henderson was a man whose reputation for integrity extended throughout the territory. His wife Martha was the same woman who had made the beautiful quilt for Clara's room. And the 3rd man was Sheriff Robert Hayes, whose badge carried real authority in this jurisdiction. "Mrs. Turner," Pastor Henderson said warmly as Clara emerged onto the porch to greet them, using the title that made her heart skip despite knowing it wasn't technically accurate. "Samuel tells us you've had some unwelcome visitors making legal threats." Sheriff Hayes studied the fraudulent court documents with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to recognizing forged papers. "These aren't worth the paper they're printed on," he announced after careful examination. "The court seal is wrong. The judge's signature doesn't match records I have from Cook County. and the jurisdiction claims are completely fabricated. Relief Clara felt was overwhelming, but Sheriff Hayes's next words tempered her optimism. The problem is, fraud this sophisticated suggests we're dealing with people who have significant resources and criminal experience. They'll be back with better forgeries, more men, or different tactics altogether. What can we do legally to protect Clara? Samuel asked, his hand finding hers in a gesture that felt both natural and possessive. Pastor Henderson smiled knowingly. At their joined hands. Well, there is one legal protection that would make it considerably more difficult for anyone to claim authority over over Miss Bennett. Clara felt her cheeks warm as she realized what he was suggesting. Marriage would indeed complicate any scheme to forcibly remove her from Nebraska, especially if her husband had legal standing to contest such actions. "Daniel," Martha Henderson said with gentle reproach, "you're putting the cart before the horse. These young people need to make such decisions based on their feelings, not legal expediency. What if the feelings and the legal expediency happen to align?" Samuel asked quietly, turning to face Clara with an expression that made her heart race. "Clara, I know this isn't the romantic proposal you deserve, but I can't stand the thought of anyone taking you away from here. From me." The vulnerability in his voice, the way his large hands trembled slightly as he held hers, moved Clara more than any flowery declaration could have. This gentle giant who had paid $50 for someone the world considered worthless was now offering her his name, his protection, and his heart. "Samuel," she said softly, aware that their audience was witnessing what might be the most important moment of her life, "I would be honored to marry you. Not because of legal threats or practical necessity, but because I love you." The admission hung in the air for a moment before Samuel gathered her into his arms, lifting her feet clear off the ground in an embrace that conveyed joy, relief, and promises for their future. "Well then," Pastor Henderson said with satisfaction, "I believe we can arrange a wedding ceremony that will provide both spiritual blessing and legal protection. When would you like to hold the service?" "As soon as possible," Samuel replied without hesitation. "If Mrs. Blackwood and her associates are planning to return with reinforcements, I want Clara legally protected before they arrive." Sheriff Hayes nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. I'll also send word to the territorial marshal about this fraud attempt. He'll want to investigate whether this is part of a larger criminal operation targeting successful ranchers." Over the next 3 days, the Turner Ranch became the center of intense activity as news of the upcoming wedding spread throughout the scattered community. Neighboring families arrived with offers of assistance, bringing food, decorations, and the kind of support that bound frontier communities together in times of need. Clara found herself surrounded by women who treated her not as an auction house purchase but as a bride deserving of celebration and joy. Martha Henderson took charge of organizing the ceremony, while the wives of other ranchers collaborated on creating a wedding feast that would be remembered for years. "Tell me about your dress," asked Sarah Mitchell, wife of a cattle rancher from the next valley. "Do you have something special planned?" Clara's face fell as she realized she had nothing appropriate for such an occasion. Her wardrobe consisted of practical work clothes and the few garments Samuel had provided for everyday wear. The beautiful life they had built together had made her forget how limited her material possessions remained. "I hadn't really thought about it," Clara admitted. "Everything happened so quickly, "Nonsense," Martha Henderson declared with the authority of a woman accustomed to solving practical problems. "We'll create something beautiful. I have ivory silk that's been waiting for the right occasion, and between all of us, we have lace, pearls, and everything else needed for a proper wedding gown." The next 2 days transformed into a remarkable display of community cooperation. While the men discussed security arrangements and legal strategies for dealing with Mrs. Blackwood's likely return, the women worked with needle and thread to create a dress that would make Clara feel like the bride she deserved to be. But it was the evening before the wedding that brought the most significant revelation. Clara was in her room, trying on the nearly completed dress while Martha made final adjustments, when Samuel knocked on the door with urgent news. "Clara, Sheriff Hayes just received a telegram from Chicago," he called through the door. "You need to hear this." She wrapped a robe over the dress and joined Samuel and the sheriff in the main room, her heart racing with apprehension about what news might have arrived. "It's about Mrs. Victoria Blackwood," Sheriff Hayes announced. "The Chicago police have been looking for her in connection with several confidence schemes targeting wealthy families. She's not representing any legitimate legal interests. She's running a criminal operation that specializes in fraud and extortion." The news was both relief and vindication. Clara's instincts about the woman's true motives had been correct. "There's more," the sheriff continued. "According to the Chicago authorities, she's been working with a network of associates who identify successful individuals in remote areas, then use various schemes to separate them from their assets. Your ranch's prosperity and Miss Bennett's presence here made you perfect targets." Samuel's expression darkened with anger. "So they intended to kidnap Clara and use her to access our bank accounts or force me to pay ransom for her return." "Most likely," Hayes confirmed. The inheritance story was probably just the opening move. Once they had Miss Bennett in Chicago, they would have found other ways to extort money from you. Clara felt sick at how close they had come to falling victim to such a scheme. Without the sheriff's investigation and the community's support, she might have been deceived by Mrs. Blackwood's authoritative manner and false documentation. "The good news," Hayes continued, "is that federal marshals are now involved. Mrs. Blackwood and her associates are wanted for interstate fraud, which means they're facing serious federal charges if caught." The wedding morning dawned clear and beautiful, with spring sunshine streaming through the ranch, house windows and the sound of arriving guests filling the air with excitement. Clara stood before the mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. The dress Martha and the other women had created was a masterpiece of frontier craftsmanship. The ivory silk flowed in elegant lines that complemented Clara's figure while concealing the slight asymmetry caused by her old injuries. Delicate lace trimmed the neckline and sleeves, and tiny pearls caught the light like dewdrops on morning flowers. More importantly, Clara could see in her reflection a woman who had reclaimed her worth and dignity. The defeated, desperate person who had stood on the auction platform 6 months ago had been transformed into someone who knew her value and had found a man who cherished it. "You look beautiful," Martha Henderson said softly, making final adjustments to Clara's hair. Samuel is going to be speechless. As Clara prepared to walk downstairs and marry the gentle giant who had seen her true worth, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been sold as damaged goods for $3, but had discovered that her real value couldn't be measured in currency. The threats from Mrs. Blackwood had forced Clara and Samuel to confront their feelings and commit to a future together. In trying to destroy their happiness, the criminals had inadvertently strengthened the bond between them and provided the catalyst for a love that had been growing since their first meeting. As the sound of Pastor Henderson's voice carried up from the main room, beginning the ceremony that would unite her life with Samuel's forever, Clara smiled at the beautiful irony of it all. She had been auctioned as damaged goods, but the gentle giant who bought her had received the greatest bargain of his life, and she was about to become the luckiest woman in Nebraska territory. The wedding ceremony took place in the main room of the Turner Ranch House, transformed into something magical by the combined efforts of the entire frontier community. Wild prairie flowers filled every available vase, their bright colors creating a cheerful contrast to the room's masculine furnishings. The massive stone fireplace had been decorated with garlands of greenery, and someone had managed to find enough white fabric to create an improvised altar area near the large windows that overlooked the rolling ranch land. Clara descended the stairs on the arm of Jack Morrison, who had volunteered to give her away in the absence of family. The weathered ranch foreman had cleaned up remarkably well for the occasion, his usually work-stained hands scrubbed clean and his graying hair neatly combed. More importantly, his expression of genuine paternal pride made Clara feel truly welcomed into the ranch family, but it was Samuel's face that captured her complete attention as she entered the room. The gentle giant stood beside Pastor Henderson wearing his best suit, a dark blue wool that emphasized his broad shoulders and made his eyes appear even more brilliantly blue. His usually controlled expression was transformed by wonder and joy as he watched her approach, and Clara could see him struggling to maintain his composure. "You're beautiful," he whispered as she joined him before the improvised altar, his voice rough with emotion. "More beautiful than I ever imagined possible." The ceremony itself was simple but deeply meaningful, Pastor Henderson's words emphasizing the spiritual significance of two people choosing to build a life together through mutual love and respect. When Samuel repeated his vows, his deep voice carried clearly through the crowded room, each promise made with the sincerity of a man who understood the full weight of what he was pledging. "I, Samuel Turner, take you, Clara Bennett, to be my wife, my partner, and my equal in all things. I promise to cherish your intelligence, protect your dreams, and love you with everything I have for all the days of my life." Clara's own vows had been carefully crafted to reflect the unique journey that had brought them together. "I, Clara Bennett, take you, Samuel Turner, to be my husband, my protector, and my dearest friend. You saw worth in me when the world saw only damaged goods. You gave me dignity when I had lost hope. I promise to be your true partner in building the life we both deserve." When Pastor Henderson pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel's kiss was gentle but passionate, a promise of the love and partnership that would define their marriage. The room erupted in cheers and applause from their assembled friends and neighbors, creating an atmosphere of joy that made Clara feel truly blessed. Wedding feast that followed showcased the best of frontier hospitality. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by every family in attendance: roasted beef and chicken, fresh bread and preserves, vegetables from carefully tended gardens, and desserts that demonstrated the impressive culinary skills of women who had learned to create beauty with limited resources. Clara moved through the celebration, feeling transformed not just by her new status as Samuel's wife, but by the acceptance and affection shown by the frontier community. These were people who judged others by character and capability rather than past circumstances, and they had clearly decided that Clara Turner was worthy of their friendship and respect. "Mrs. Turner," said Elizabeth Mitchell, wife of a neighboring rancher, "Tom and I want you to know how grateful we are to have you in our community. It's rare to find someone with your education and refinement who also understands the value of honest work." Similar sentiments echoed throughout the afternoon as Clara was welcomed into the informal network of ranch wives who supported each other through the challenges of frontier life. For the first time since her attack in Chicago, she felt genuinely accepted as part of a community rather than merely tolerated as an unfortunate necessity. It was near sunset when the Misa celebration was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Sheriff Hayes, who had been keeping watch throughout the festivities, immediately moved to the windows with several other men following close behind. "Riders coming in fast," he announced grimly. "Looks like Mrs. Blackwood and her associates have returned with reinforcements." Clara felt her stomach drop as she realized their perfect day was about to be shattered by renewed threats. Samuel immediately moved to her side, his protective instincts overriding any consideration of their wedding celebration. "How many?" Samuel asked, his voice taking on the hard edge that Clara had learned to associate with serious danger. "8 riders," Hez replied, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "More than they brought before, but not overwhelming odds given our numbers." The ranch hands and neighboring men quickly organized defensive positions, while the women gathered the children into the most protected areas of the house. Clara found herself caught between fear for their safety and admiration for the way their community came together to face this threat. Mrs. Blackwood's group rode into the ranch yard with an arrogance that suggested they expected easy victory. The refined woman from Boston was accompanied by 7 rough-looking men, whose bearing marked them as professional criminals rather than legitimate law enforcement officers. Samuel Turner, Mrs. Blackwood called from the safety of her position. Behind her hired guns, I've returned with proper legal authority to collect Miss Bennett and resolve this matter according to law. Samuel stepped onto the front porch with Clara beside him, his massive frame radiating protective determination. "It's Mrs. Turner now," he announced clearly. "We were married this afternoon by Pastor Henderson in front of 30 witnesses. Your claim to authority over my wife has no legal foundation." Mrs. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly at this unexpected development. "A frontier marriage has no standing in proper courts," she replied, though her voice carried less certainty than before. "Miss Bennett's legal obligations remain unchanged." Sheriff Hayes emerged from the house carrying official documents that he had received by telegraph that morning. "Actually, Mrs. Blackwood, your legal standing has changed considerably. Federal marshals in Chicago have issued warrants for your arrest on charges of interstate fraud and extortion. You're wanted criminals, and I'm authorized to take you into custody." The announcement created visible confusion among Mrs. Blackwood's associates, several of whom began looking around nervously as they realized they had walked into a trap rather than an easy score. "Those documents are fabricated," Mrs. Blackwood protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "We represent legitimate legal interests in the recovery of stolen property. The only thieves here are you and your associates," Clara said, stepping forward despite Samuel's protective gesture. The confidence in her voice surprised even herself. "You're criminals who prey on successful families by using false legal claims to justify extortion and kidnapping." Mrs. Blackwood's mask of refined respectability finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator underneath. "You little fool," she snarled. "Do you think marriage to this frontier giant will protect you? We have resources you can't imagine and reach that extends far beyond this isolated territory." "Perhaps," Samuel replied calmly, "but you made one critical error in your planning." "And what would that be?" Mrs. Blackwood demanded. "You assumed we were isolated and helpless," Samuel said with a slight smile. "What you failed to realize is that frontier communities take care of their own." As if summoned by his words, the sound of additional horses announced the arrival of more riders. But these were not Mrs. Blackwood's reinforcements. They were federal marshals accompanied by a company of territorial militia, all armed and clearly prepared for serious business. The lead marshal, a stern man whose badge carried genuine federal authority, rode directly to Mrs. Blackwood's position. "Victoria Blackwood, you're under arrest for interstate fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Your associates are also being detained pending investigation of their involvement in your criminal enterprise." The speed with which Mrs. Blackwood's carefully planned scheme collapsed was almost anticlimactic. Faced with overwhelming legal and physical force, her hired guns immediately surrendered rather than face federal charges for resisting arrest. Mrs. Blackwood herself maintained her arrogant composure until the moment handcuffs were placed on her wrists, but Clara could see the defeat in her eyes. "This isn't over," Mrs. Blackwood hissed as she was loaded into a prison wagon. "There are others who know about your situation, others who will continue to pursue this matter." "Let them come," Samuel replied evenly. "Mrs. Turner and I will face whatever challenges arise together, with the support of our community and the protection of legitimate law." As the federal marshals departed with their prisoners, the wedding celebration resumed with even greater enthusiasm. The successful defense of Clara and Samuel's happiness had transformed their marriage from a simple ceremony into a symbol of frontier justice and community solidarity. "I can't believe it's really over," Clara said as she and Samuel stood on their front porch, watching the last of their guests depart under a star-filled Nebraska sky. The threat that had loomed over their happiness for weeks had been eliminated, leaving them free to build the future they had both dreamed of. "The immediate threat is over," Samuel agreed, gathering her into his arms with gentle possessiveness. "But Mrs. Blackwood was right about one thing. There will always be challenges for people like us to face." "People like us?" Clara asked, looking up into his beloved face. "People who refuse to let circumstances define their worth," Samuel replied softly. "People who see value where others see only damage. People who understand that real treasure isn't measured in dollars, but in the strength of the hearts that choose to beat together." As they stood together under the vast Nebraska sky, Clara reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the degradation of a Chicago auction house to the joy of her wedding day. She had been sold as damaged goods for $3, but the gentle giant who had seen her true worth had received a treasure beyond price. The woman who had once been considered worthless had found her value reflected in the eyes of a man who understood that the most precious things in life couldn't be bought at any auction. They could only be recognized, cherished, and protected by hearts wise enough to see beyond surface appearances to the luminous soul within. Their greatest challenges might still lie ahead, but Clara Turner faced the future with absolute confidence. She had found her worth, her purpose, and her perfect partner. Together, they could overcome anything. 2 years after their wedding, Clara Turner stood in the doorway of the newly completed schoolhouse, watching her husband direct the installation of the final window frames. The one-room building represented more than just educational opportunity for the growing frontier community. It embodied the dreams and determination of people who refuse to let circumstances limit their children's futures. "Mrs. Turner," called young Timothy Henderson, Pastor Henderson's 10-year-old son, "will you really be teaching us arithmetic and literature, just like they do in the big city schools?" Clara smiled at the boy's enthusiasm, remembering her own hunger for learning during her days working at the Chicago Public Library. "Better than big city schools," she promised. "We'll be learning practical skills alongside academic subjects, things that will help you build successful lives whether you choose to stay in Nebraska or venture out into the wider world." The schoolhouse project had been Clara's initiative, born from her recognition that the scattered ranch families needed education for their children that went beyond basic reading and writing. Her proposal to establish a proper school had met with enthusiastic support from the community, and Samuel had donated both land and lumber to make the dream reality. But Clara's contributions to their growing community extended far beyond education. Over the past 2 years, she had become the unofficial coordinator for mutual aid among the ranch families, organizing assistance for families facing illness or hardship, managing shared resources during difficult seasons, and serving as correspondent with territorial authorities on matters affecting their region. The Territorial Governor's Office has approved our request for an official post office, Samuel announced as he approached the schoolhouse, wiping sweat from his brow after a morning of construction work. "They're sending an inspector next month to evaluate our proposal for establishing Clariton as an incorporated town." The name still made Clara blush with pleased embarrassment. When the community had grown large enough to warrant official recognition, the settlers had unanimously voted to name their town after the woman whose intelligence and organizational skills had been instrumental in its development. Clara had protested that such honor was unnecessary, but Samuel had pointed out that naming rights traditionally went to the person who had done the most to build community infrastructure. "Have you given more thought to the mayor question?" Samuel asked as they walked together toward their ranch house, now expanded with additional rooms to accommodate Clara's growing collection of books and Samuel's workshop for the furniture-making business that had developed alongside his ranching operations. Clara sighed at the reminder of another community responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. With Clariton's incorporation would come the need for local government, and the community had made it clear they expected Clara to serve as their first mayor. The idea of holding elected office seemed almost surreal to someone who had once been sold at auction as damaged goods. "I'm still not convinced I'm the right person for such a role," Clara admitted. "Leading a community requires different skills than organizing mutual aid or teaching children." "You've been leading this community for 2 years already," Samuel pointed out with gentle logic. "Making it official would just acknowledge what everyone already knows, that you're the person we all turn to when important decisions need to be made." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, and Clara looked up to see a familiar figure riding toward their ranch. Dr. Margaret Walsh had established a medical practice in the territorial capital of Lincoln, but she made regular trips to outlying communities to provide healthcare services where none existed. "Dr. Walsh," Clara called in greeting, pleased to see the woman whose friendship had become precious to her. Margaret Walsh was one of the few women Clara had met who had also overcome significant obstacles to build a meaningful career, and their conversations provided intellectual stimulation that Clara treasured. "Clara, Samuel," Dr. Walsh replied as she dismounted near their front porch. "I have news that I think will interest you both, though it concerns matters beyond Nebraska territory." Over coffee in their comfortable kitchen, Dr. Walsh shared information she had gathered during her recent trip to Denver for a medical conference. "There's been significant attention paid to your story in reform circles," she explained. "The way you've transformed from auction victim to community leader has inspired people working to change laws about women's rights and frontier justice." Clara felt a mixture of pride and discomfort at the idea that her personal struggles had become part of larger social movements. "I never intended to become a symbol of anything," she said carefully. "I was just trying to survive and build a decent life." "That's exactly why your story is so powerful," Dr. Walsh replied. "You didn't set out to prove any grand points about women's capabilities or the possibility of redemption. You simply refused to accept that your circumstances defined your worth. And you built something remarkable from what others considered ruins." Samuel reached across the table to take Clara's hand, his touch conveying support and understanding. Over the past 2 years, they had occasionally received letters from strangers who had heard their story and wanted to share their own struggles or ask for advice. Each correspondence reminded them that their personal triumph had broader significance. "There's something else," Dr. Walsh continued. "I've been asked to extend an invitation for you both to speak at a conference in Denver this fall, a gathering of educators, reformers, and territorial leaders discussing the future development of the American West." The invitation represented an opportunity Clara had never imagined possible. To be recognized as someone whose experiences and insights had value to other leaders and thinkers seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. "What would we be expected to discuss?" Samuel asked practically. "Community development in frontier regions," Dr. Walsh explained. "Specifically, how isolated settlements can create educational and economic opportunities that attract families and build sustainable prosperity. Your success in establishing Clariton has been noticed by territorial planners." That evening, as Clara and Samuel sat on their expanded front porch watching the sunset paint the Nebraska sky in brilliant colors, they discussed the implications of Dr. Walsh's invitation and the broader recognition their story was receiving. "Part of me is honored by the attention," Clara admitted. "But another part fears that people are romanticizing what was actually a very difficult and frightening experience." "Maybe that's exactly why your perspective is valuable," Samuel suggested. "You can speak truthfully about both the challenges and the possibilities, helping others understand that transformation requires genuine effort and courage, not just good intentions." Clara's contemplation was interrupted by movement in the yard. Below, where she could see their newest ranch hand, David Miller, working with one of the young horses. David's story had striking parallels to Clara's own. He had arrived at their ranch 6 months earlier, scarred both physically and emotionally from experiences during the Civil War. Seeking work and a chance to rebuild his life, Samuel had hired David despite his obvious struggles with what Army doctors called soldier's heart, the inability to cope with loud noises, sudden movements, or crowded spaces that affected many veterans. Under Samuel's patient guidance and Clara's gentle encouragement, David had begun to heal and discover his remarkable talent for training horses. David's progress reminds me of something I've been thinking about, Clara said, watching the young man work with quiet confidence that had been absent when he first arrived. Maybe our story isn't really about overcoming auction houses or criminal schemes. Maybe it's about the power of seeing potential where others see only damage. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. When I bid $50 for you that day, I wasn't trying to prove any grand points about human worth. I just saw someone who deserved better than what the world was offering her. And when I chose to stay here instead of seeking other opportunities, I wasn't making statements about women's roles or frontier equality, Clara added. I was choosing to build a life with someone who valued all of me, not just the parts that met social expectations. Their conversation continued as the stars emerged in the clear Nebraska sky. Two people who had found in each other not just love and partnership, but a shared vision of what life could become when built on foundations of mutual respect and genuine affection. The next morning brought a telegram that would further expand their horizons. The territorial governor was requesting Samuel's input on legislation regarding frontier community development, while the territorial superintendent of education wanted Clara's recommendations for establishing schools in remote regions. It seems we're becoming more prominent than either of us intended, Samuel observed as they read the official correspondence over breakfast. Or maybe, Clara replied thoughtfully, we're finally becoming the people we were always meant to be. And it's taken others time to recognize what was there all along. As Clara prepared for another day of teaching in the schoolhouse that bore testament to her determination to improve their community, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. The woman who had once been valued at $3 now found herself consulted by territorial leaders on matters of education and community development. But more significantly, she had discovered that true worth couldn't be assigned by auctions or determined by others' opinions. It had to be recognized within oneself and confirmed by those whose love and respect had been genuinely earned. Gentle giant who had seen her potential had received far more than he had bargained for. But Clara suspected that the true treasure had been their mutual discovery that two people working together could build something far greater than either could achieve alone. As she walked toward the schoolhouse where eager young minds waited to be challenged and inspired, Clara Turner carried with her the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought at any price. They could only be cultivated through courage, protected through love, and shared through service to others who still searched for their own recognition of worth. 5 years after Clara's auction in that Chicago warehouse, she stood at the podium of the Grand Opera House in Denver, looking out at an audience of territorial governors, educators, business leaders, and social reformers who had gathered to hear her speak at the Western Development Conference. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman once sold as damaged goods was now being asked to share her insights on building prosperous frontier communities. Ladies and gentlemen, Clara began, her voice carrying clearly through the ornate theater. When I was 19 years old, I believed my life was over. I had been attacked, scarred, and abandoned by a society that judged my worth by my appearance rather than my character. I stood on an auction platform, listening to men bid on me like livestock, convinced that I would never again be seen as fully human. The audience listened with rapt attention as Clara recounted her journey from desperation to purpose, carefully balancing honesty about her struggles with hope about the possibilities that existed, even in the darkest circumstances. But I learned something in that warehouse that changed everything about how I understood human worth, she continued. It's not what others are willing to pay for us that determines our value. It's what we're willing to invest in ourselves and in the people around us that creates true prosperity. Samuel sat in the front row, his expression radiating pride and love as he watched his wife command the attention of some of the most influential people in the American West. Beside him sat Dr. Margaret Walsh, Pastor and Martha Henderson, and Mayor David Miller, the former soldier who had found healing at their ranch and gone on to become Clairton's elected leader after Clara had declined the position to focus on territorial educational initiatives. The town of Clairton began with one man who was willing to see potential where others saw only damage. Clara said, her eyes finding Samuel's in the audience. It grew because that same principle was applied to every person who arrived seeking a second chance. Today, Clairton is home to over 300 families, boasts the highest literacy rate in Nebraska Territory, and serves as a model for sustainable frontier development. The statistics she cited represented years of careful planning and collaborative effort. Clairton's success hadn't happened by accident. It was the result of deliberate policies that welcomed people regardless of their past circumstances, invested in education and infrastructure, and created economic opportunities based on each person's capabilities rather than their social standing. After her presentation, Clara was surrounded by conference attendees eager to discuss the practical details of community development. A representative from the Colorado Territorial Government wanted to know about educational funding mechanisms. A group of women reformers sought advice on establishing schools in remote mining camps. Several business leaders inquired about the economic principles that had made Clairton's cooperative ventures so successful. But it was a conversation with a young woman from California that would prove most significant for Clara's future plans. "Mrs. Turner," said Miss Jennifer Collins, a teacher from San Francisco, "your story has inspired me to consider establishing a school for women who have faced circumstances similar to yours. Women whose society has written off but who still possess intelligence and capabilities that could be developed." The idea struck Clara with immediate force. Throughout her travels and correspondence over the past several years, she had received countless letters from women facing various forms of social rejection, widows struggling to support families, women who had fled abusive marriages, immigrants whose accents and customs marked them as outsiders. All possessed skills and intelligence that society refused to recognize. "Tell me more about this concept," Clara encouraged. Her mind already working through the possibilities, Miss Collins explained her vision of an institution that would provide both practical training and academic education for women who had been marginalized by conventional society. Not a charity, but a genuine school that would prepare women to become teachers, business managers, even community leaders in their own right. Clara's excitement grew as she recognized the potential for such an institution to transform countless lives. What kind of support would be needed to make this vision reality? Financial backing, influential sponsors, and most importantly, someone whose own success could demonstrate what these women might achieve. Miss Collins replied meaningfully. That evening, Clara and Samuel walked through downtown Denver, discussing the opportunities and challenges that Miss Collins's proposal represented. The city around them bustled with the energy of rapid growth and development, but Clara found herself thinking about the women in hidden corners who watched this prosperity from the margins. It would mean expanding beyond Clairton, Samuel observed, as they paused to look at the construction of a new hotel. Taking on responsibilities that would require significant travel and time away from home. "Are you concerned about that?" Clara asked, studying his expression for signs of reluctance. Samuel was quiet for several moments before responding. "I'm concerned about the demands it would place on you, not about supporting something you believe in. You've transformed one community already. If you want to help transform the opportunities available to women throughout the territories, I'll support that goal completely. His unwavering faith in her capabilities still had the power to move Clara deeply, even after 5 years of marriage. It wouldn't be something I could do alone, she said thoughtfully. It would require a team of people committed to the same vision. You've already built one successful team, Samuel pointed out. The people of Clariton didn't become a community by accident. You identified their strengths, created opportunities for them to contribute meaningfully, and helped them see possibilities they hadn't imagined. Those same skills would be valuable for this new project. Over the following months, Clara threw herself into developing a comprehensive plan for what would become the Western Women's Educational Institute. Working with Miss Collins, Dr. Walsh, and a growing network of supporters, she designed a curriculum that would combine practical skills training with academic education, preparing women to become teachers, business managers, medical assistants, and community organizers. The institute would be located in Denver, taking advantage of the city's resources and transportation connections, but would maintain strong ties to frontier communities that needed educated women to support their development. Students would come from throughout the territories, recommended by local leaders who had identified women of potential who lacked conventional opportunities. But perhaps most importantly, the institute would operate on principles that Clara had learned from her own experience, that human worth couldn't be measured by past circumstances, that everyone deserved opportunities to develop their capabilities, and that investing in marginalized people often produced extraordinary returns. The official opening of the Western Women's Educational Institute took place on a crisp October morning, 3 years after the Denver conference. Clara stood before the first class of 36 students, women ranging in age from 18 to 45, each carrying stories of hardship overcome and potential waiting to be developed. Among them was Maria Santos, a widow from New Mexico, whose husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with 3 children and no means of support. There was Sarah Mackenzie, a former slave from Tennessee who had walked to Colorado seeking education for herself and opportunities to help other freed slaves. Anna Kowalski had fled an arranged marriage in Poland and arrived in America with nothing but determination to build an independent life. Ladies, Clara addressed her first class, you are here not because society has finally recognized your worth, but because you have recognized it yourselves. Over the next 2 years, you will develop skills that will enable you to support yourselves and your families with dignity. More importantly, you will learn to see yourselves as leaders capable of creating positive change in your communities. The Institute's success exceeded even Clara's optimistic projections. Within 5 years, graduates were teaching in schools throughout the territories, managing businesses in growing frontier towns, and establishing their own educational programs for women facing similar challenges. The network of Institute graduates became a powerful force for social progress throughout the American West. On a warm spring evening 10 years after the Institute's founding, Clara sat on the front porch of their Clariton ranch house reading letters from former students who were now established professionals throughout the territories. Samuel joined her as he finished his evening chores, settling into the chair beside hers with the comfortable ease of a man completely content with his life. Letter from Sarah Mackenzie, Clara reported. She's been elected to the school board in Pueblo, Colorado. First woman and first former slave to hold the position. Samuel smiled at the news. Any word from Maria Santos? She's opening a second medical clinic in Santa Fe. Says she's treating patients in both English and Spanish now, serving families who previously had no access to health care. These success stories had become a regular feature of their evenings, evidence that the principles they had discovered in their own relationship, seeing potential rather than damage, investing in capabilities rather than dwelling on limitations, could transform entire communities when applied systematically. Do you ever regret how it all began? Samuel asked as they watched the sunset paint the Nebraska sky in brilliant colors. The auction, the circumstances that brought you here? Clara considered the question seriously, as she had many times over the years. I regret the attack that started it all, she said finally. I regret the poverty and desperation my family endured. But the auction itself, the day I met you? I can't regret something that led to everything I treasure most. She gestured toward the thriving town visible in the distance, its lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Claritin exists because we met that day. The Institute exists because of what we learned about human potential. Hundreds of women have built successful lives because someone was willing to invest in their worth when no one else would. Samuel reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand, his touch still capable of sending warmth through her entire being after all these years. You know what I think about most when I remember that day? What? How everyone in that warehouse thought they were witnessing someone being sold for $3. But what actually happened was that I had the opportunity to recognize a treasure that was beyond price. Clara laughed softly at his romantic interpretation of what had been, objectively, one of the worst days of her life. You paid $50, not $3. Best investment I ever made, Samuel replied with absolute sincerity. Though I have to admit, I had no idea I was getting a wife, a business partner, a community leader, an educational pioneer, and a woman who would change the lives of thousands of other women. As the stars emerged in the clear Nebraska sky, Clara reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the depths of despair to heights of fulfillment she had never imagined possible. The young woman who had been sold as damaged goods had discovered that her true value couldn't be measured in currency. It could only be recognized by hearts wise enough to see beyond surface appearances to the luminous possibilities within. Gentle giant who had seen her worth had received far more than he had bargained for, but then again, so had she. Together, they had learned that the most precious things in life, love, respect, purpose, and the opportunity to serve others, couldn't be bought at any auction house. They could only be recognized, cultivated, and shared by people courageous enough to invest in the belief that every human being carries within them treasures waiting to be discovered by those with eyes to see. The woman once valued at $3 had become priceless, not because the world had finally recognized her worth, but because she had learned to value herself and use that knowledge to help others discover their own immeasurable treasure. And in the end, that transformation multiplied across hundreds of lives and dozens of communities, proved to be the most valuable legacy of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.